Hello, and thank you for joining in once again to these devotional messages. We've been in the book of Psalms, and for the last couple of messages now, we've been in Psalm 139. We're looking at this psalm from the perspective of David proclaiming three attributes of God. He does this in the first 18 verses of Psalm 139. Following these proclamations of God's attributes, he then affirms his loyalty to God based on these attributes, beginning at verse 19 and taking it then through the end of this chapter. We consider the first attribute, as David writes, of the God who knows me, or God's omniscience in verses 1 through 6. And then in our last devotional, we considered the second attribute of God, as proclaimed by David, the God who is with me, or God's omnipresence. We see that in verses 7 through 12. We come now to the third attribute of God, described by David in verses 13 through 18. And here we see the God who created me, or his omnipotence. So let me read. This is Psalm 139, verses 13 through 18. David writes, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee." So again, here we see David describing the omnipotence of God, or the God who created me. He describes this attribute of God in the same way in which he has described God's omniscience and God's omnipresence. That is, in regard to how it relates to us. So this is not doctrine in the abstract for David. This is personal. Who God is has direct bearing on our lives. So in describing God's omnipotence, David relates it to God's activity in creating us. We are fashioned by an omnipotent God. As such, David shows us how God cares about our beginning. That's verses 13 and into verse 16. And God cares about our future. That would be verses 16 through 18. So I want to take a closer look at these two main topics. We'll consider first, the Lord formed my body, or my beginning. Again, that's verses 13 and into verse 16. We can observe at least three things here regarding God's creative work in us. We see, first of all, the completeness of our creation by God. That's verse 13, again, where David says, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb." It seems that what David is describing here in this verse is that God has formed us as both a spiritual and a physical being. There is a completeness to God's work. So first we note here that we are spiritual beings. David says, "For thou hast possessed my reins," or "For you created my inmost being." The Hebrew word for reins that is used here is literally kidneys. For the Hebrews, the kidneys represented the seat of emotions. Now, I understand that sounds strange to us, as though a heart, a blood-pumping muscle, is somehow more acceptable, but that's the word we would use, the word heart. Well, the Hebrews use the word kidney. You have possessed my inmost being, the seat of my emotions. So David is saying here that we are more than just physical. The Lord has formed the individual as a spiritual being. And that is why there is within the heart of man a longing for God, a void, an emptiness that truly only God can fill. God has placed that there when He designed us, when He fashioned us. We are spiritual beings. But of course, we are also, and obviously, physical beings. David says, "Thou hast covered me in my mother's womb." Or literally, "You have knit me together." David here pictures God as a master weaver at work in our mother's womb, creating us directly as He created Adam out of the dust. God is the author and creator of life. He created us inside and out. There is a completeness to His work of forming us. So we see the completeness of our creation by God. Then we note here the awesomeness of our creation by God. And that's verse 14. David says here, "I will praise Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are Thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well." This truth regarding God's creative work in forming us causes David to break out in praise. He is awestruck with wonder, amazement, and reverence at God's magnificent creation. And think how much more we know today about the human body than what David knew. How can we not stand amazed in God's presence as we contemplate His marvelous works? There's an awesomeness about what God has designed and how He has made us. So we see the completeness of our creation, the awesomeness of our creation, and then we see the intricacy of our creation by God. And that's verses 15 and into verse 16. David says here in these verses that even while we were yet in our mother's womb, he describes the secret place and the depths of the earth in verse 15. He is describing that time before our birth. Even there, we were intricately woven by God. So God cares about our beginning. He was intimately involved in forming us down to every intricate detail. But we see another amazing truth. The Lord not only formed my body, but also the Lord foreordained my life. This describes my future, verses 16 through 18. You'll notice two things that David says here about this. We see, first of all, the plan of God established in verse 16. Let me read that verse again. "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect or incomplete, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them." David says that even when we weren't much, we were something to God. In fact, God wrote all the details of my life in His book. This is a poetic way of stating God's foreknowledge of all the details of our lives. In other words, God had a reason for creating us as He did. He does not act according to whim or impulse, but according to His eternal plan. So God wrote all the details of my life in His book, and then God fashioned and formed all the days of my life when none of them yet existed. In other words, David is showing us here that God has a plan for each of our lives, and He created us uniquely to fulfill that plan. For the Christian, we know that He has recreated us at the time of our salvation, where we become new creatures in Christ, a new creation in Christ, and He has gifted us to fulfill His plan in performing the works that He has prepared for us to do. We see that in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God has before ordained that we should walk in them. God has a plan for our lives, and God has created us, fashioned us in such a way that we are able, with His empowerment, to fulfill that plan He has for us. Nothing has been left to chance. Nothing has been left out. We can never say that we could not do what God has called us to do because we weren't gifted. We didn't have this or that ability. We have everything we need as carefully designed by God to perform and to complete His will for us. So we see the plan of God established here in verse 16. And then finally, we note here the praise of God proclaimed. Once again, as David does in verse 14, he concludes this section with an ongoing word of praise. Verses 17 and 18, how precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. So once more, these wonderful truths inspired David to break out in praise to his God. He is aware of just how precious it is that the Lord has plans for His people. The omnipotent Creator extends His thoughts toward us. He does so in such a way that He is involved intimately in creating us, in forming us, so that we can do His will. What a wonderful God He is. Our God, as we see here in Psalm 139, is a God who knows us, a God who is with us, a God who created us. He is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. He is worthy of our praise.